Hanson, engage.
I have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Give us some men who know the truth. And who will declare the truth. And who will stand with Athanasius and Polycarp and Calvin and Luther and Whitefield and Edwards, and who will declare from the housetops that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation.
Welcome to the Engaged Truth Show. I'm Caleb Harrelson, your host today for the show. You can find us on Engage Apologetics Facebook page or on the Engaged Truth YouTube channel. If you can go ahead, like, subscribe, and share the show so that more people can engage with the truth, we'd really appreciate that. Well, I'm so excited about today's episode as this is part 2 of our series on the Grand Canyon. And in part 1, we talked about how the Grand Canyon layers were laid down during the global flood. We see evidence that the ocean waters flooded over the continents, rapid burial of creatures and plants, widespread and rapidly deposited rock layers, long-distance sediment transport, and rapid or no erosion between the layers, and rapid succession of the rock layers. And so today we're going to get into part 2, and so I'm going to bring on our guest again for the Grand Canyon series, my friend Nate Loper. So let's go ahead and bring him on. Nate, how are you doing today, brother? Oh, hold on. I think you're muted there.
There we go. Now you can hear me.
Hey, all right.
Hey, it is great to be back. Great to see you again. Yeah, excellent.
Yes, sir. Well, for those watching who didn't catch the first part of the series, you can go back and you can watch that video. The recording is fully there on Facebook and YouTube. Now, Nate, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and Canyon Ministries again for our first-time viewers and listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Nate Loper, and I'm with Canyon Ministries, one of the directors here. And we are a ministry that works in the Grand Canyon. We've been there now going on 24 years now this coming year. So if you want to throw that screen up there, I can show them a little bit about what we do here at the Canyon. We do all kinds of stuff at the Grand Canyon. A lot of what we do are river trips, and we do rim tours daily up on the south rim of the canyon. We also do hiking tours. We do backpacking trips. I mean, fantastic stuff that we do. And like I said, we've been operating now. This will be our 24th year up the Grand Canyon doing trips and tours and all kinds of stuff that we offer. And people can book at canyonministries.org. They can jump on there. In fact, they can book a tour the very same day. We'll be able to do that tour for them for some of our different tours that we offer.
Oh, that's so awesome. And like I said before, and I'll still say it again, that, man, I can't wait to go on a tour with you guys. Incredible ministry. Now, if you were to sum up, what is the heartbeat of Canyon Ministries? How would you say that? How would you put that?
Yeah, Caleb. I mean, honestly, what we do is one thing, but why we do it is actually the most important part, the most important aspect. And that is the Grand Canyon is a fantastic location, a fantastic laboratory, if you will, to see and to study and to understand what we call flood geology. Mm-hmm. And more than just talking about rocks, and more than just a fun time on a river trip or a hiking tour or seeing it from the rim, the most important thing that we can convey about the Grand Canyon, beyond the geology, beyond what we see from the science, is actually the heartbeat of our Creator God. I mean, we unashamedly and completely, believe in God's word from cover to cover. And so the days of creation, we believe that God did in fact create all things within those 6 days. And we believe that there was a global flood in Noah's day. And we believe this canyon is tremendous evidence of that flood event. But, beyond that, when we see the canyon, Caleb, there's so much more to it. It not only reveals the evidence and the veracity of God's word, but in many ways, I believe it reveals the heartbeat of our Creator God. I'm going on now, this will be my 12th or 13th year now, I believe, running tours at the canyon. And in hundreds and hundreds of days, whether on the rim or on the river down below, every single day I'm up there, I'm reminded of not only God's glory, because we can see his handiwork, But I'm reminded of something even more important, and that is God's love, his redemptive plan of salvation. There are so many similarities and parallels that we can draw from the ark in Noah's day. There was a coming judgment. There was, wrath because of sin, the sin of mankind. God, as a righteous judge, had to judge sin. He couldn't just allow that sin to prevail. I mean, what a completely terrible, wicked world we would have today if that happened, right?
Yeah.
But there was a coming judgment, but God provided a way of salvation, you see, and that was the ark in Noah's day. The Bible tells us, in fact, if you read it, reveals to us that once they were loaded up on board the ark, ready to go, it says that the door of the ark remained open for 7 days. 7 days, it was an open invitation. And the people who were standing around the ark, watching him build this ark for all this time, hear him preaching about the coming judgment, about the flood that was going to happen, about the wrath that was going to happen. The Bible tells us Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Now, for those people standing there who were hearing this message and seeing him build this ark, all they had to do to be saved from that coming judgment was to walk through the door of that ark. As I said, the door remained open for 7 days. It was an open invitation. But Genesis 7:11 tells us that God himself closed the door of that ark, and on that very same day, the flood happened. But God provided a way of salvation. And if you look at it, God provided that way of salvation so that those who saw Noah building this ark and heard him as his preacher of righteousness, they couldn't stand before God on Judgment Day and say, God, this is all your fault. We never even had a way to be saved. No, God provided a way of salvation. He was patient. He was long-suffering. He was merciful. He showed love in that ability to give them that choice to step through that ark of salvation and step through that door onto the ark. And in a very similar parallel, you might say, there's a very interesting thing we see with Jesus. We have a coming judgment, right? Not by water this time, but by fire. But if you look at it, there is a door of salvation. I mean, Jesus himself said, behold, I am the door. That door of salvation is open today, but that door will close, we believe. But when you look at a place like the Grand Canyon, what we see there revealed to us is not only judgment and wrath on display, but we see incredible beauty. We stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon like 6 million other people and just admire and awe of what we see down below us. But beyond just what we see with our own eyes, we can understand the one who made it, the one who did it all. There is beauty in wrath, you might say. There is a love and redemption even in judgment. And my friend, there is a gospel message in that Grand Canyon. And in fact, we have a video that I'd love for you to show so we can see a little bit about what the gospel message of the Grand Canyon is.
Yeah, let's take a look at it.
Yeah.
I'm John Elbert with Canyon Ministries, standing on the south rim of Grand Canyon. There's roughly 6 million people from all over the world that come here to enjoy Grand Canyon. And they come to a place such as this because of the beauty that you can see behind me. This place is absolutely magnificent, stunning in color and in landscape and in texture. In fact, the landscape of our entire world has a beauty to it that we invest vast amount of time and money to go and to travel and vacation and enjoy. But when we view the Grand Canyon through a biblical perspective, we recognize that the landscape of Grand Canyon, the landscape even of our earth as a whole, it is not original creation. In fact, it is the result of this global catastrophic event described in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. But that leads to something very important for us to consider and to understand. What we're seeing here and around our world is a result of this catastrophic global event that took place during Noah's time and described in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. Now, God had every right to leave the post-flood world a complete and total wasteland. But he didn't. He wove incredible beauty into that judgment, into that wrath. Beauty that we see and enjoy here at Grand Canyon. But when we take just a couple of moments to consider that truth, it becomes pretty profound in what it means. First of all, if God's wrath can be this beautiful, what is heaven going to look like? It's going to make this look like an eyesore. I mean, he's creating that out of love, not out of wrath. But it's also giving us a window into the very heart of God. It's telling us a little bit about the purpose of his wrath and the purpose of his judgment. The purpose of his judgment is not to destroy, but to redeem, to make it new. And that is incredible for us to take time to think about it. I mean, even the Apostle Peter tells us that Noah wasn't not just a boat builder, but he was a preacher. He was a herald of righteousness, which means the entire time he's building this boat, he's also going, come on, y'all, let's go. Let's go. The wrath of God is coming, but I got a boat, and this boat has got a door in it. And you know, if anybody at Noah's time, no matter how vile they had been, no matter what they were guilty of, and obviously it was pretty atrocious, if they would have walked through the door of that ark, they would not have been destroyed by that flood. But they rejected that message, and they rejected the door. You know, the creator of the universe is also our Redeemer. In John chapter 1, verse 14, we discover that the Word, that which created absolutely everything, became flesh and made a dwelling among us. And while Jesus was here, in John chapter 10, verse 9, he says, I am the door. And anybody that walks in through him is going to be saved. The exact same message. But the question becomes, are we going to learn from history? Or are we this time around going to say, absolutely, I'm going to walk through the door of Jesus Christ and I'm going to be made new? You know, you think about the Israelites, they wandered around for 40 years before they actually got to go into the promised land because they hadn't trusted God. And in Joshua chapter 4, we see this incredible account where they finally get to enter the promised land, but they got to cross the Jordan River. And the Jordan River is at flood stage. So the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, they've got to go and they've got to put their foot in that raging river. It didn't back up first. They had to trust God that they weren't going to be swept away by that river, but put that foot in, it did. It backed up. And they stood on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan River, and all of Israel passes by, entering into the promised land. But before the Ark of the Covenant was allowed to leave that dry ground, God told the people, go get some rocks, and to take those rocks and to put them in a pile. And the whole purpose of that pile of rocks was a monument to what had taken place. The next generation was walking along in that same area and they saw that pile of rocks. They'd look at their mom or their dad or their uncle or whoever and say, hey, what's up with these rocks? And that was a call out to the older generation to go, let me tell you. Let me tell you about the wonders of God. Let me tell you about the awesome things that happened right here, what that means for us today and what that means for our future. Well, the same is true when people come here. When those people from all over the world travel here to Grand Canyon and look out here, you can't help but look out there and go, well, what's up with the rocks? And when that question's asked, we, God's people, are supposed to have the humility and the courage to stand up and say, let me tell you. Let me tell you about the wonders of God. Let me tell you about the majesty of God and what this landscape means. The truth that God absolutely is going to defend His holiness. He is going to judge sin, but He is a God who redeems, wants you to be made new. He is a God that takes something that is broken and fallen apart and has rebelled against Him, and He makes it a brand new creation. The old is gone, and the new has come. That's what God does. That's what this landscape is proclaiming. So when we just take a breath for a moment and look at the landscape of Grand Canyon through the lens of Scripture, we quickly realize that this is not just a canyon. This is a monument to the heart of God, a God who wants you to be made new, a God who came in the flesh into our world to save us and has given us a door of Jesus Christ to walk through so that we could be made new. It's not just a canyon, it's the gospel.
Hey man, that was an amazing video. I'm so glad we could see that and see that the heart of Canyon Ministries is for the gospel and the proclamation and defense of the gospel and to lead people to worship. And we see even in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter says, for they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water, but the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. And we see that there will be a global return of Jesus, and there, just like there was a global catastrophic flood, but God made a door of salvation, an ark of salvation in Christ. So last week, or not last week, in episode 1, we talked about how the Grand Canyon is evidence of the global catastrophe. And now we're going to look at the issue of now how was the Grand Canyon carved, and what was going on after as the floodwaters were receding. So, Nate, how would you break that down from a biblical creationist perspective?
Yeah, Caleb. So, last time we talked about basically the layers of the canyon being deposited and laid down. And in many ways, if you think about it, the Grand Canyon is very much like a layered cake. You've got all these different layers, but, if you're going to make a cake, you first of all have to make those layers, and you have to kind of bake those layers, and then you cut into that cake, and then you get to enjoy the cake for what it is, right? It's kind of like what we have at the Grand Canyon. We have multiple steps of the process, you might say, for Grand Canyon formation. The first part of it, that we're looking at here is the deposition of all these layers, the depositing of these sedimentary, 4,000 feet of sandstone, limestone, and shale from the Tapete sandstone all the way up to the Kaibab limestone that we believe were deposited during that year-long flood. But there's much more to it, right? There's more that we see in the environment and even in the region. And so today we're going to talk about the kind of the carving of the canyon, the carving down through those layers, the cutting of that cake, so if you will, that we can enjoy and see and experience today.
Right. Very good. So now as the floodwaters were receding, as we see this issue of now what would be happening when the floodwaters are going down? What kind of things would it have caused erosion on the land, or what do you think was going on then?
Absolutely, yeah. During the flood, we have the initial stages of depositing some of the sediments at the Grand Canyon. We kind of have two different models, as we talked about last week or last time, of either millions of years of slow gradual advances and retreats of oceans that slowly deposited up layers over the course of millions of years, or a massive amount of erosion from different places around the world and more sediment being brought into the landscape as the floodwaters propelled sediment and fossils and things like that all over across the continents. And so kind of two different models, but what we see at the Grand Canyon is really only kind of a small snapshot, if you will, of what we believe was deposited during this year-long flood. When you go and look around the region, we have, especially up towards the north, what we call the Grand Staircase. And so the Grand Staircase is really, there's multiple other layers that were deposited on top of the rim rock of the Grand Canyon, which is the Kaibab limestone. So kind of here, which if you look at this picture, this is not necessarily to scale, but you can see, the Grand Canyon, those layers that basically go up to the Kaibab limestone. And then as you go up towards the north, you encounter up into Utah, parks like Zion National Park, Bryce Canyon National Park, all the way up towards Cedar Breaks, where you actually encounter multiple other layers of sediment that were deposited on top of what we see at the Grand Canyon. Now, when we look at the Grand Canyon, we're only looking, we're looking a mile deep, but most people don't realize we are missing an entire package of rocks on top of the canyon. We are missing a vast majority. In fact, more layers are missing from above the Grand Canyon than what we see within the Grand Canyon itself.
Yeah.
We have huge volumes of sediment that have been removed by massive amounts of erosion, we believe, after the entire sequence was deposited. Now, we refer to that, Caleb, oftentimes as sheet erosion or denudation, where a massive amount of material was removed. And if you think about it, it's exactly the kind of thing we would see from a global flood. If we had water that brought in sediment and was covering the entire world, as the Bible describes, as that water then receded and retreated off the continents, it would drag with it all kinds of sand and debris, all kinds of freshly laid soft mud and sediment, kind of in a very similar way that we actually see and observe if you go to the beach. You see a wave rises up against, and it brings in some seashells and some sand, but as that wave on the beach retreats, you can see it drags with it sand and seashells and debris back down. It pulls it back off the land.
Yeah.
And the very same thing would happen with a global flood. As the waters are receding off the continents, it would also be removing and eroding some of that material that it had just previously laid down during the buildup stage, you might say, of the flood. We have this retreating stage of the flood, which takes place likely from day 150 onwards during the flood, as the floodwaters then begin to recede, the Bible describes in Genesis chapter 8. We see this recession of stuff, and we see what we call sheet erosion, as the water is acting as one big giant sheet and pulling material off the continents. Right. And it removes roughly 6,000 to 8,000 feet perhaps of material off the top of the Grand Canyon sedimentary layers, all these layers of the Grand Staircase, are now pulled away in certain regions, like we see at the Grand Canyon. We're missing, a mile and a half, you might say, of sediment that should have been on top of the Grand Canyon, but is no longer there.
Wow. So what's the secular model to explain what happened with all of these layers that were eroded off in the Grand Staircase?
So when it comes to the Grand Staircase removal, there's not a lot of stuff you're going to find in the national park. So if you go to the Grand Canyon, you're not really going to see a lot mentioned or talked about it. And I have yet to find a satisfactory model that I would even find, from a different perspective of that, because it's just not talked about. Not only are we missing that material from the top of the Grand Canyon, but that material is not even found in the surrounding, desert landscape, you might say. It hasn't just been removed from the Grand Canyon, it's been removed from the continent. And we find, I believe, some of that material off the coast of the continent. Like you go down to the Gulf of Texas there, looking out there, and you can find, hundreds of miles out there, we have things like the Loper sand, which is a massive, sand and sandstone formation that's been basically just tremendous amount of surface material off the continents has been dumped far out there. And so it's an incredible, I believe, an incredible testimony of a massive amount of water receding and retreating off the continents.
Wow. We have an interesting comment related to that here from Fincer for Jesus. He says, the secular model has the same mechanism, but they have rising and falling seas for each layer, but no sheet erosion until the last one. Now, that's interesting, because if what he's saying is on point here, it seems that it must have been a catastrophic erosion. But in their model, if they have the rising and falling seas, like we talked about in part one, it seems like you shouldn't find the all of the rest of the sediments as far away as we do.
Yeah, I mean, that would require a sheet erosion process too, a catastrophic process.
Yeah, catastrophic is key.
Catastrophism is not something that you typically see oftentimes utilized in the standard geological models. It's just, they avoid that oftentimes. Now, they do talk about periods of, punctuated catastrophism and things like that. But by and large, we oftentimes talk about slow processes. And so I believe, Caleb, not only do we see this at the Grand Canyon itself and this, the Grand Staircase, but, there are other, I believe, geological remnants around the world that we see too. As the floodwaters receded off the face of the earth, certainly we would have formations that were built up. We would have canyon formations. We would have landscapes that were eroded, during this flood recession stage. A lot of other different canyons and things like that. Now, it might surprise you, and we're going to talk about it today, but we don't actually believe the Grand Canyon was created or carved necessarily by the flood itself. Now, there are some different models, and that's perhaps one main model that has been used, or some people kind of think, but our favored model, you might say, for what we teach at the Grand Canyon is a little bit different than that, and we're going to get into that, but it surprises many people, especially people I talk to that work up at the park and other tour guides and rangers and things, when they find out we actually don't believe that the flood itself in Noah's Day carved the canyon directly. We're going to talk about that today and some of the reasons why. But absolutely, the flood receding did scour out landscapes. We believe that's, Zion Canyon, up at Zion National Park. That was part of that mechanism, as the flood recession, many other canyons around the world and features and erosional remnants that you might see. Like Monument Valley, you can see in this picture here. These little mittens, these little, buttes sticking up here. Yeah. They've not been pushed up from underneath. It's not uplift. It's actually all the material that's in between there has been removed away. And it hasn't just weathered into the surrounding desert landscape. Otherwise, you would see it all over there. This material in between here, and quite a bit above it too, has been completely removed from the landscape. And there's very little debris, even at the bases of these, formations, very little debris of active weathering and erosion that you could see if it was a process of slow, gradual, millions of years of slow erosion. Again, a massive amount of water, sheet erosion, you might say, would be the mechanism for much that we see throughout the Southwest, because a lot of that has been preserved for us. We don't have trees and plants and things growing in that weathering process that is, made greater because of trees and things like that. We see the desert landscape as a very good snapshot remnant of what might have happened at the end of the flood, or at the processes that we're going to talk about for the formation and carving of the Grand Canyon.
Right. Hey, we had a good comment from Jim here on Facebook. Let me pull that up. Post-flood event, maybe even after people had come to the Western Hemisphere after Babel.
Hey, Jim, good to see you, buddy. Absolutely. And that's exactly when we place the carving of the canyon event is sometime after the flood that we're going to talk about today, maybe a few hundred to even up to 1,000 years, perhaps. And during a time when people absolutely could have been around here as eyewitnesses of this canyon formation. In fact, every one of our Native American tribes around here, they all believe and hold to an idea that this canyon was formed from a big flood event. And so we begin to see this, that they may have been eyewitnesses and their ancestors eyewitnesses to the global flood. And that story was passed on. And the carving of the canyon formation, as we're going to talk about, they in fact could have been eyewitnesses to a post-flood carving canyon event after they had arrived in this area that would place them, if we look at the Bible timeline, it places them in this exact location in the right time for this canyon to be formed, as we're going to talk about today. And they could have been eyewitnesses. And I believe absolutely it was that. So yeah, let's dive in here, Caleb. Let's talk a little bit about that ice age and that time period. How about that?
Yeah, let's do it. So now, do you want to break down how the flood could have caused the ice age at this point, or?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
I think Jim is fantastic in bringing in the kind of next segue that we want to get to. So thank you, Jim. So this ice age period, that's another part of the picture, you know. We have a lot of things taking place, and what we see from scripture, we see from science, we see from rocks and geology, we begin to add all this together. And the ice age is absolutely one of those things. We do believe that there was an ice age. I know some people have questioned that, said, well, there couldn't have been an ice age, you know, if there was a flood. Absolutely believe there was an ice age. Yeah. We believe that it took place after the flood in Noah's day, that this ice age lasted for perhaps 700 to 1,000 years, peaking probably right around 500 years after the flood. And in some modeling that you can actually see, we believe that the flood itself helped create this ice age. Michael Ord has done a lot of work, a fantastic climatologist who's done a lot of work in the climatology in putting together a model of the ice age alongside with Dr. John Baumgartner, another person who's kind of modeled and put a lot of this stuff together. Now, one of the questions about the ice age, even from a standard model, is how did the ice age form or happen, and how did it end? Now, unlike some of the other models, we believe that there was one ice age, basically, one major ice age that lasted, like I said, for about 1,000 years, perhaps. We see direct physical evidence of that ice age. You know, we do see scouring of the landscape and the surface. We see things like terminal moraines where, you know, glaciers have pushed a bunch of material and it halted, and the glacier melted back, but it left basically like the bulldozer push of that. I've been to Central Park in New York City, and you can see in Central Park, the rocks there were scoured by glacial movement, glacial till that moved across these rocks. And you can actually multiple rocks in Central Park in New York. If you live or go around that area, you can actually see the striation scouring marks on there. Wow. So we do believe, based upon some of the physical evidence, that there was actually an ice age. Now, how does the flood come into play with this? How does the flood bring about an ice age? Well, interesting to think about, you know, how do we get an ice age? To get an ice age means you got to have a lot of moisture, you might say, brought onto the continents in the form of glaciers and of snow and things like that. And I believe, Caleb, that the flood helps explain that quite a bit. You see, if we look at what happened during the flood, you know, we talked about last time about some of the breakup of the fountains of the deep. We talked about how things happen around the world. During this time, we believe that the continents were broken apart. They moved and began to slide around rapidly, continental sprint, you might say. Mm-hmm. But during this time, we believe that there was a lot of heat that was added to the ocean from the fissure points, you might say, of where these continents are breaking apart, where there might have been superheated, water that was flashing into steam, lava that was coming up into the oceans that warmed the oceans quite a bit. And from what we see in some of the rocks and geology, we see that perhaps the oceans around the world were warmed up to about 86 degrees Fahrenheit on average.
Wow. That's a hot ocean.
That's a hot ocean. Now, today's ocean temperatures on average is about 39 degrees Fahrenheit. But during the flood, we're talking about 86 degrees. I mean, you could be swimming at the North Pole. Pretty fantastic. Now, that warmth in the ocean, is the oceans are warmed, Likewise, or the opposite of that, you might say, on the land, once the flood receded and once the floodwaters, for the most part, drained off the continents, we're now left with a supercooling process on the earth, on the land itself. For one, evaporation. We have a super saturated landscape. As that water is evaporating, and it's drying and it's evaporating, it's actually cooling with, taking away evaporative heat from the continent, the land itself. in a very similar way that, we sweat and it evaporates and it cools us off. The land is getting cooler during this time period. So the oceans are warm, the land is cooler. We also have other cooling effects taking place because during this flood, during the year-long flood process, not only did we have, tsunami-like waves, volcanoes, but we had all kinds of things, this volcanic ash and debris that was being sent into the landscape of the earth, into the atmosphere. Those aerosols or those particles of dust was going up into the land, into the air. And during this time period, I would believe blocking out a lot of that sun and the heat and the ultraviolet radiation. Now, we know that takes place. We absolutely can observe it physically when volcanic eruptions take place. It cools the atmosphere down. It doesn't, basically allow the sunlight to radiate and hit the surface of the earth. So we have another cooling mechanism at play. We have evaporative cooling from the surface of the earth. We also have added to that a lack of heat, sunlight, warmth on the face of the earth. So what we have, Caleb, is a much cooler surface or landscape of the earth and a much warmer ocean. Well, what happens? Well, you plug that into computer modeling, which has actually been done. All you have to do is plug in a warm ocean in a cooler land like that, and you get an ice age that happens.
Yeah.
Because what happens is in the oceans, the warmth of the oceans is causing an increase of evaporation from the ocean. That moisture and all of that is moving across the continents, and it's dumping onto the continents with massive storms of huge rain and also of snow. I mean, during this time period, we would have massive storms that could dump perhaps up to 100 inches of rain. And in the northern climates and places where it's a lot cooler, that rain is falling as snow, and it's falling so quickly that it can't melt, but it accumulates in huge layers of snow and of ice that get compressed down, in some places miles thick. Okay? And so then that process of heat being transferred basically up into the air, rising over, falling onto the continents, is creating an ice age very, very rapidly. And then as that heat energy is then lost, Caleb, near the end of this ice age period, that heat energy is lost from the oceans and the particles, settle out from the atmosphere, the sun begins to warm things up, that process kind of reverses. And we end up having now a melting back of these glaciers, a melting back of this ice. And basically things kind of go back to normal, kind of like what we see today.
Right.
But during that ice age period, we do have, because of all the ice on the continents that is miles thick, we have a lowered ocean level around the world. That lowered ocean level around the world exposes things like land bridges, where we would have people that could travel more easily around from the Ark, from the Tower of Babel event. From there, they're now spreading throughout the world. We have land bridges that are exposed from Siberia down through Alaska into North America. And those corridors are actually kept ice-free during this ice age period because they're so close and surrounded by warm ocean waters. So right along the coastlines, or right along where the oceans are at, the warmth of that is actually keeping a nice ice-free corridor. And during the ice age period, people could actually migrate from basically the Tower of Babel, if you will, all the way from there, all the way to South America, walking on dry land the entire time. Even following herds and migrations of animals that were traveling, from the Ark at that point and becoming climate adapted and cold adapted to the landscape, like the woolly mammoth and rhinoceros and Lasmosaurus, all these different animals that we see during this, what we call kind of an ice age, or you might say Pleistocene period. They're traveling and they're migrating, and I believe a lot of people groups are following the herds of animals and food, and that's leading them into the Americas. We're not to talk about the archaeology and things like that, or the people groups, but we basically believe that there are multiple waves of migrations that took people into the Americas, and when they came and settled in this area, they perhaps could have been eyewitnesses to things like the Grand Canyon being formed by a catastrophic process, or other catastrophic processes that took place as a result of the aftermath of the flood, or the melting back and things that happened during the ice age.
Wow, yeah, that would be quite a sight. Now, you have people migrating. You have several hundred years of the ice age as a result of the flood, which you broke down really well. Now, even before we move on from that issue, is the secular models, as far as the ice age go, what is their model or mechanism for an ice age to begin with?
That's still a working thing that they're trying to figure out. I mean, it is difficult based upon what we see happening today and how you get an ice age started. And I think it's even more difficult, Caleb, to figure out how we end an ice age. In the flood model we're talking about for the ice age formation, the heat energy, is in the oceans, and that goes into the continents, and then, things warm back on the continents and the recedes and everything retreats and the oceans cool back down. And that naturally ends the ice age period. But, if you have kind of a snowball Earth, you might say, and you get stuck in that, how do you somehow get warmth back up? There's a few different models on there, but that would be a whole different topic and talk if we want to go to the meteorological ice age. We could do a whole session on just that.
For sure. Yeah, something maybe for the future. But I did want to point out, though, that a global catastrophe, a global catastrophic flood, really does seem to be the best explanation, and I think it is, for an ice age. And really, the best part of your model is how much it can explain, and I think it explains the data extremely well. So now we're looking at the floodwater receding after the ice age, or the end of the flood, and then causing the ice age. And so we're probably going to have things like these giant lakes forming, right, all around North America. Do we see any evidence of that, or did all the water just funnel off and back into the ocean?
No, at the end of the flood, I mean, we would have puddles and pockets of water all over the planet. Absolutely. Some of those big puddles and pockets of water, you might say, probably froze during the ice age, but also, the glaciers that were there, as they melted away, these glaciers also, formed lake systems and things like that. I mean, I believe our Great Lakes, just like it's taught, normally, I believe absolutely our Great Lakes are the formation of glaciers that scoured at the landscape and then stopped in place, and then they melted back and filled up these pools. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. In modeling, if you look at a global flood and you believe that flood really happened, you would see, okay, well, what happened even after that flood? As the flood waters receded, you would have puddles and pockets of water. Any kind of basin sitting out there would become a natural catch basin or pool, or could develop as a lake from the retreat and receding of the flood waters. Absolutely. And I think, one of those great models that we see, one of those great examples, you might say, is the Missoula, Lake Missoula, and that subsequent catastrophic breach of that formed a massive, scouring of the landscape. And Lake Missoula, kind of up there in eastern Washington, up in the Channel Scablands area, you see up there. It was a big mystery as far as how it was formed, until they finally figured out that there was this big, ice age, you might say, lake, a big lake that was held in place, or held back by a glacier. And once that kind of melted back, this whole lake system began to dump through, and it probably dumped into multiple series of other lakes. But it scoured over the landscape, catastrophically ripping up the landscape, plucking up, we had underwater tornadoes, you might say, caulking and ripping up the landscape, dropping off of cliffs and making huge, scouring deposits, going all the way from basically, you see over there in Montana and Idaho, all the way through there, through the Channel Scablands, going out all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Many geologists even believe that it carved out the Columbia River Gorge, just like that. Rapid and catastrophic from a ice age, or near the end of the ice age, you might say, breach dam catastrophe that ripped out that landscape.
Wow, that's so fascinating. And now I was reading some recently about Harlan Bretz in early 1900s, who proposed this idea, but he was mocked because I think a lot of it was a uniformitarian assumption. And now it's pretty much well accepted that the Channel Scablands were formed by a breached dam. So I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, he was mocked and basically mocked out of the room when he tried to present the fact that he believed that there was some kind of flood event, because naturally any flood event that they had heard about or were talking about at that point was the global flood in Noah's day. And you can't talk about catastrophe and flood. I mean, and like I said, now you go up there and they talk about that event and how he sent them a telegram and said, get up here, you got to see this for yourselves. And when they finally did, they realized, and said, literally, how could we have been so wrong? I mean, it's the evidence is right in front of you when you begin to look at it. And I believe the same is true when you look at a global flood event. When you begin to see and to, as scientists, model out what a flood would look like and do, I think not only do we see evidence, of a post-flood breach catastrophe for the Lake Missoula, but in other places around the world, and we're going to talk about even tying in related to Grand Canyon.
Okay, yeah, so let's get to that. Now, is there evidence of lakes that existed right around Grand Canyon, or is just an idea that people like to mock? But the issue is, if we're seeing things on the ground, looking at the rocks and looking at the dirt and what it says, what are you finding out there?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I mean, Caleb, we live in a fantastic day and age where we have access to amazing things of scientific tools and technology.
Yeah.
When it comes to understanding the landscape and the landforms, one of the best tools that we can find right now that we can use is things like satellite imagery. You know, you can go stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon. You can look down a mile below you, but you really can't see the full 277 miles of the Grand Canyon standing on the rim. And not even in an airplane. Really, to really see the full scale and size of it, you really need to get way up and above in satellite imagery. Yeah. And then not only does it reveal the Grand Canyon itself, but it reveals so much more. It reveals the entire landscape. And you begin to, you know, you might say, pursue the terrain and put together the picture of Grand Canyon formation, we can see that there's so much more involved. Now, you know, when it comes to the formation of the Grand Canyon, there is multiple different theories still being proposed. I mean, we are 150 years into sending geologists through the Grand Canyon, studying it and exploring it. And yet we still, in the scientific community, by and large, do not have a consensus by everyone on how it was formed. You know, we talked about last time, but, you know, multiple theories have been proposed, from John S. Newberry talking about, you know, spill through a massive amount of water, to perhaps an earthquake that broke open the landscape, to the Colorado River slowly carving out the Grand Canyon over 5, 6, or even 70 million years. But again, looking at things like what we have access to with satellite technology is helping to reveal to us one of the growing ideas among even everyday secular geology, and that is the fact that this canyon perhaps could have been carved, and we believe it was carved catastrophically by a massive lake system. Yeah. The satellite imagery we're talking about absolutely reveals, I believe, that there were some massive lakes that are out there. Now, this idea of a lake breach dam, you know, spillover is not a brand new theory, nor is it a crazy creationist theory. It has been around since the 1800s. Back in the 1920s, I believe it was, you know, some of these lakes, even some of the names of the lakes, like Hopi Lake, was proposed back in the 1920s or 30s as one of the lake systems to breach this. Back in 1990, 95, somewhere right around there, you know, Dr. Stephen Austin produced a book about Grand Canyon Monument to Catastrophe. And in there it talks about this. And then even back in 2000, Dr. John Douglas, who, as far as I know, is not a creationist nor a Christian by any means, John Douglas also proposes this. We'll talk a little bit about that later too. But the idea that there was a massive body of water, or a big lake system, you might say, is not a new thing to science and geology. It's been around for a long time. It hasn't gone away yet. In other words, it's still a proposed model and idea in everyday geology, creationist or non. But this is how I tend to see it. I mean, there are a couple different models that we look at, even some even within creation science communities. But by and large, the leading creation ministries, most of those geologists, those creation geologists that I know of and we work with daily, tend to agree with a kind of a breach dam or lake spillover model for the formation of the Grand Canyon, rather than a flood carved canyon or a carving at the end of the flood. Most of the guys that I know that we work with and live and are active in the Grand Canyon, most of them kind of hold to this sort of model. But the few things that I'm going to share with you guys today are brand new because I actually get a chance to live here. So as we live here, we can pursue the terrain, as you might say. We can actually go out and examine this entire landscape. Now, one of the things that we see here, and in this picture you can see, is the kind of outline of some big lake systems that you see here. And so one of those lakes you can see there called Hopi Lake, and that was proposed, that name Hopi Lake was proposed, like I said, back in the 1920s. Another name for that, oftentimes kind of the more scientific technical name that I tend to use, is Lake Bittahochi. You'll see that more often in the scientific literature, and that's what I tend to refer to it as. Up to the north there, you can see another lake there called Grand Lake, oftentimes also called Canyonlands Lake, because it kind of covers the Canyonlands area. But what you're looking at here is basically the four corners of Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. And these two kind of big lake systems were also tied in, I believe, with a third lake up towards the north there, up just above the Book Cliffs. You can see up into Utah. This is called Uinta Lake, or sometimes called Lake Vernal. And so this lake system, you might say, we believe was there because you can see the outlying shores and edges of the once existing lake system. And this entire lake was sitting in the middle of what we call the Colorado Plateau.
Right.
Now, that Colorado Plateau that you can see here is not exactly flat straight across like most plateaus you're thinking of. The Colorado Plateau is a big uplifted section. We talked about the formation of it a little bit last time. But the Colorado Plateau is actually shaped like a giant bowl, like a big dish, with a big rim of mountains and uplifted all around the perimeter. So it makes a natural, giant, big uplifted bowl, you might say. Now, this big bowl, this Colorado Plateau, is exactly where we believe in the middle of it housed this huge lake system. So you go back to here, you can see the kind of the dotted white outline. Now, that dotted white outline kind of shows you the outlying perimeter of that Colorado Plateau. And that plateau, in the middle of it, we believe, is where this lake system was at. Now, if you look at satellite imagery or great tools, I've got some tools that I use in understanding, the paleogeography of this area and the landscape. One of the things that I'm studying currently for my degree is an archaeological and kind of a geoarchaeological paleotopography, which is really a long fancy word for basically meaning the study of ancient landscapes and landforms in relation to archaeological finds and where people might have lived and moved and migrated to. And a lot of that has to do with water on the landscape, so that where there might be a dried up lake basin that we can't see today, using things like GIS, satellite topography and things like that, we can reveal some of what used to be in the past and how land is shaped and shifted, and water especially in a dry desert Southwest like we have here in the Four Corners area. Anyhow, if you look at this map, you can kind of see even the outlying shores and edges of where this lake system used to be at. And with this tool that I have, you can actually plug in water levels. You can literally say, show me where water would fill up and where water would cover the landscape at any elevation you want, from zero, right there at sea level, all the way up to, 60,000 feet if you want. Yeah. But you begin to plug in a model of what we see as far as where we believe the floodwaters rose to, where this lake system was sitting at, where this water rose up to. And you can see a massive lake system that would be filled in by this water. Now, this is not simply just a drawing on a piece of paper. This is not simply, let's just color in where we think the lake was. This comes directly from the software that I use, that you plug in this software and say, show me water. And I believe this water is at 5,700 feet in elevation. Mm-hmm. So show me water filling the landscape in the middle of the Colorado Plateau at 5,700 feet. Show me where this would fill up. And this fills up this lake basin. Now, going back and forth, you can actually see, we take away the water, you can actually see the outlying shores and edges of where that water used to go up to. So with satellite imagery, you can see the shoreline environment in this entire landscape. And there's more to it that we're going to talk about too. But this lake system, when you plug it in and look at the entire Colorado Plateau, which here I've outlined the Colorado Plateau kind of in the yellowish orange color in the middle of the lakes. Again, the plateau is a giant bowl all around it. Now you can fill up the Colorado Plateau with water all the way up to a breaching point, and it would still be contained within this giant, massive bowl. And it's like a bowl, you have a bowl of water, you begin to pour water into it, and it continues to fill up and up and up until it starts to spill over. This bowl would contain a massive amount of water. And, the classic typical picture that, I showed before here kind of shows us about that much water. That's as much water as we would see at about 5,700 to 5,800 feet in elevation of the water. So, but looking at it, I believe that it's actually a little bit higher than that, based upon what we see with shoreline environment and some actual physical erosional features we see from a lakeshore environment. I believe the water that was contained in these lakes was sitting right around 6,725 feet. And when you plug in about 6,700 feet, it takes it from basically this picture to a little bit bigger. And it actually connects these lakes together as a massive joined lake system, as one basically super lake initially at the very beginning. And I believe that right around here, about 6,725 feet, is where the lake was at its most in its containment, before what happened is a breach that carved out the canyon. Now, this lake system is huge. We're talking about, if you look at it on the size of North America, we're talking about roughly the size of the Great Lakes. This lake system not only was huge in size and in scale, but the elevation models, we see the basin of this lake system right around 4,200 feet in places, but it rises up to perhaps 6,600 feet, giving us a lake system that could be in some places up to 2,000 feet deep, full of water. Now, we're talking about a lot of water. We're talking about thousands of cubic miles worth of water on the landscape, trapped in the middle of the Colorado Plateau, as you see here in this animation that I created. You can see how much water that we're talking about covering this landscape. That's a lot of water. And again, it's held in place by a giant bowl. Now, looking here, it's kind of even hard to see the Grand Canyon, right? But let's zoom in here. Let's take a look at the Grand Canyon. As we zoom in towards the Grand Canyon, you can see actually it's kind of a teeny tiny scratch in the earth compared to how big this lake system really was, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, compared to that lake, it totally seems plausible that it would carve a massive canyon.
So not only do we see evidence of a lake because of the shoreline environment that you can actually map out pretty easily with the terrain, But we find something else, Caleb. Where we find this lake basin, especially, for example, nearby that Hopi or Hopi Lake that I talked about, that's the closest one to my house where I live here. So that's the one I oftentimes am out at studying and researching because it's a lot easier to access. But out there in this lake basin, we find a leftover remnant of a freshwater mud bottom deposit, a lake bed basically, known as the Hopi Formation. Now, that Hopi Formation you can see out there in the secular geological modeling, they look at this and they even say that Hopi Formation is basically a blink of an eye geologically. They place things like the Chindley Formation underneath it for being, hundreds of millions of years older than the Hopi Formation sitting on top of it. This Hopi Formation seems to be the lake basin that was formed in these kind of edges, especially of this lake system. Now, that is a known, formation among secular geology. We know about the Hopi Formation. You go out there and you study it. So again, there's not only evidence of this lake system with these shoreline environments, but we see that the lake system that we see out there is evidenced by the freshwater mud bottom deposit. Now, that Hopi Formation is actually found in the form of greenish-looking clays. Now, it's important to understand because greenish clays are typically formed in deep water environments where there's not a lot of oxidation. Not only do we find, though, greenish clays down there, Caleb, we also find freshwater mollusks, lake mollusks, shells and from like snails and things like that that typically live in freshwater environments. So again, it indicates to us that this is found, showing us that there was a freshwater lake and this Hopi Formation, going back to this Hopi Formation, we find the Hopi Formation, especially as you go out towards to the east of here, you go out to the Hopi Buttes area, you go out to White Cone, all these different areas out there, you can actually see that the Hopi Formation is typically found in the range of about 6,300 feet in elevation up to 6,600 feet in elevation. In other words, this lake system had to at least be 6,600 feet high, which is right about the same elevation that I placed the maximum height of the water of the lake at 6,700 feet. Now, of course, the water at the very top is not producing the lake bed. That's at the bottom of that lake system. So I'm talking about, at the outer fringes, which is where we find the Hopi Formation. This, for example, is near the edge, kind of the eastern edge of this lake system. This is where we're finding there's direct evidence of lake shore deposits around the outer edges of this massive lake system.
Wow. Oh, that's incredible.
So
here we got a couple of comments on the lake here. Let's look at these real quick. We got Fincer for Jesus. Pull that up. One of the objections I've heard on this model is there not being enough water volume per land volume removed. I think they would say it would be a 3-to-1 ratio water to land and should be 10-to-1. Is that an issue?
Not an issue at all. In fact, almost every model that you're going to be reading there is only talking about and referring to Hopi Lake itself. There are very few models out there, even from the secular community, that talk about the entirety of this lake system. And even in that, even when they do talk about it, they typically don't place the lake at the full total, filled volume. Kind of only showing you this, whereas if we're looking at it, there hasn't been a good study that I have found yet that examines the entire landscape yet. I haven't found one published in the Creationist or the secular geological, studies of this entire lake system that goes from Hopi Lake all the way up to Grand Lake and up into Utah. It just doesn't exist yet. I've been fortunate to be able to go out there and examine this area quite a bit. I mean, growing up in the Four Corners, I was just up in Colorado twice this year doing some studies up there, studying this landscape. So part of Grand Lake, part of the Hopi Lake areas. Most of those research and reports are only attributing this lake water to being part of what we see for Hopi Lake itself, just kind of the smaller of these lake systems there. So the kind of the very bottom little arm of it. When you put together the big picture and look at this entire landscape and use what we have available to us, like the technology that shows us lake water levels, you not only see one lake down there, but you see both these lakes. And that estimated volume of water now is not complete yet. We haven't quite figured out all this stuff. It's still a work in progress. But my initial estimates of the total volume of water are roughly about equivalent to the size of the Great Lakes. So we're talking about 5,500 feet, perhaps 5,500, cubic miles, you might say. Sorry, 5,500 cubic miles worth of water. And that's roughly equivalent to what we see with all the Great Lakes combined. That's the kind of water that I'm talking about for filling up this lake basin. We're talking about roughly the equivalent of all 5 Great Lakes combined when you put all this massive lake system together as one giant super lake. And again, it's not hard to see at all when you begin to plug in the software and plug in water elevation models to show you where this water would fill up in the Colorado Plateau. It would be completely contained with a perimeter, a bowl of mountains, a rim of mountains all around it at some point. And in the middle of that, a massive lake system. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that lake and the system and what happened there. So how does this tie in with the Grand Canyon? Well, as we mentioned, during this time period, during this, post-flood ice age is when we believe this lake system was mostly formed. Now, some of this water could have been brought in as trapped behind floodwaters from Noah's flood, puddles and pockets all over the planet. But for the next 500 to 700, maybe even up to 1,000 years, we would have water continually filling up this giant bowl. Even today, Caleb, if you would fill in the Grand Canyon, cover that thing up, fill in the Grand Canyon, to this very day, we would have a massive lake system filling up the interior of the Colorado Plateau. The Grand Canyon today provides an exit route for all that water on the plateau that otherwise, without that, would have nowhere to go. Today, all that water that was trapped up there now exits via the Colorado River. Multiple rivers and streams flow into there, and together they flow off the Colorado Plateau. But if you didn't have that crack, you might say, in the side of the bowl, you would still, to this very day, have a pretty good-sized lake system filling up that plateau. In fact, we've used the Colorado River to make some pretty good lake systems, haven't we? Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the two biggest man-made lakes in North America here, or at least in the United States that we have been formed because of the Colorado River itself that has been dammed, and that's only, 400 to 600 feet deep, those lakes. If we dammed up the Grand Canyon a mile high and said, now use that river to fill up, you absolutely easily would have a massive bowl-shaped plateau filled up with a tremendous amount of water in the middle of it, just like what we see. Again, a perimeter of mountain kind of range all around it, uplifted land higher than where we see the spillover point for the Grand Canyon Formation today. So how do we see this happening? Well, we believe that this water stayed in there, continued to rise up and up and up until maybe a couple different things happened. There's a few different models for this. One, pure spillover. As this water rose up and up and up like a giant bowl of water, it would eventually spill over a section there. This spillover would spill over the lowest point. And if you look at the entire Colorado Plateau today, one of the lowest points that we see is actually exactly where we happen to have the Grand Canyon proper begin, right there, just kind of to the east in the area of Desert View Watchtower. And you can kind of see right here, as we zoom in again, you'll see kind of where that spillover point would be. It's one of the lowest points along the Colorado Plateau. Now, that would be what we call spillover, lake spillover, the water simply rising up beyond the capacity of this giant bowl and spilling over. Again, around the rest of the Colorado Plateau, as you can see today, the rest of it is higher than the rim of the canyon, except for one little area that we see today just to the north of that, up there by Kanab, which we'll talk about a little bit later today. But if you look at it, we believe that this breach happened right about there as water either spilled over perhaps. But another part of that model we look at says that perhaps there was a fracturing, you might say, a earthquake that happened. We have fault lines right along there. So if we had an earthquake that happened that fractured the landscape, that began to shake and have some kind of earthquake at that point, it could cause liquefaction to the surrounding landscape, to the earth and the soil itself, and begin to kind of reach out the side as it spilled through. But during this time period, as we look, before this breach happened, as these lakes are filling up, it's not only just trapped behind floodwaters, but we would have water that's being brought in from multiple rivers and streams all throughout the landscape and environment, filling up this lake higher and higher and higher until it would perhaps breach. Now, in this picture, you can kind of see on the left-hand side there, Caleb, kind of an idea of what the Kaibab and Coconino Plateau might have looked like before the Grand Canyon formed. If you were there before this event happened, we believe, you'd have a lake that would rise right up against the uplift of the plateau. And then once it breached, it cut right through that plateau. And all this water, we believe, would drain rapidly and catastrophically. So imagine if you were to pour all 5 Great Lakes worth of water, if you were to pour a massive amount of water through one single exit point, imagine the carving and the erosion into the landscape that would happen. And it didn't necessarily even have to happen very quickly. As far as the initial side of it, even a spillover of a little bit of water, if it started to spill over the plateau, just that spillover might only be 1 inch of erosion. But that 1 inch of erosion goes back for hundreds of square miles in size. Now that water spills over, more water, more erosion, more erosion, more water. You end up with a catastrophic exponential runaway process that could drain this entire massive lake system through one single exit route. And as it drains through, it removes and carves out this landscape in a huge, catastrophic process, very similarly to what we saw, there with Lake Missoula and the Channel Scablands area. Rapid formation. And not only that, but as these lakes are draining down, they start off right around 6,700 feet, we believe. But as the water's draining down, at some point, we believe that the lakes began to kind of be separated by existing land masses that were separating them now, so that Hopi Lake area was separated from the Grand Lake area, and they began to pour into the canyon separately. And as they poured into the canyon separately, they began to actually carve up two little kind of finger side arms, you might say, of the Grand Canyon. One of those being Marble Canyon, which we believe was part of the Grand Lake and Uinta Lake spilling through. As that continued to flow from the north, it carved out Marble Canyon. There's some really interesting things there about the backwards facing barbs and interesting things that show us that, hey, it doesn't seem that the river did this. But then the Hopi or Bitahoche Lake section down near the bottom carved out what we believe is the Little Colorado River Gorge, which is what you see here in this picture. This is the Little Colorado River and Little Colorado River Gorge, which is not just a singular gorge, but it actually has multiple finger arms kind of going off to the side of it. And you can see here, as we're going to zoom in, I'm going to show you kind of a little spiral view of the Little Colorado River Gorge over here to the right. We'll kind of circle around there. This is another side canyon, but the Little Colorado River Gorge is a fascinating canyon because if you were to see it right around Cameron, Arizona, which is not far just outside the Grand Canyon National Park, that gorge is only about 70 feet deep. Okay, it's only about a 70-foot little canyon where the Little Colorado River flows through. Now, from there, you drive 30 minutes into the Grand Canyon, and as you drive up to there, that little gorge of 70 feet goes from 70 feet deep to 3,200 feet deep. 3,200 feet deep, right at the entrance, really, of the Grand Canyon proper, as you can see here. It increases and incisors into the landscape dramatically. So here in the picture, you can see Marble Canyon up there to the north coming in, and then you can see the Little Colorado River Gorge coming in from the southeast. This is the two separate lake systems now. Now they're separated. Hopi Lake coming in from the southeast, still flowing through there. The remaining amount of water is carving out the Little Colorado River Gorge. They're separated by an uplifted plateau in the middle from the north, as the water from Grand Lake and Uinta Lake is now coming down through that section, carving out the Marble Canyon section of the Grand Canyon. And collectively, as they join together, they're still carving out the remainder of the Grand Canyon, going out there towards the west. But basically, a lot of water in a little bit of time, we believe, did this. Not a long time in a little bit of water, okay? We would say that this happened rapidly and catastrophically. The collective draining of all this water pouring through there is what produced the Grand Canyon very quickly. Now, as I said, that is not just a crazy creationist theory or idea. It's actually proposed first by everyday geologists. And it is still being taught. And even at the Grand Canyon, we have geological meetings back in 2000. Dr. John Douglas, who you're going to see here in a video, actually proposed a lake spillover theory and still talks about it. It is still a widely held theory by many geologists. In fact, I know people that work at the park rangers, other tour guides from other companies that look at this and say, yeah, this actually makes a lot of sense. I've got a great video I want you to show here in just a second, but this is Dr. John Douglas, and this is actually on the National Geographic show. It's a program called Grand Canyon, How It Was Made. Dr. John Douglas is one of our geologists that lives here in the state of Arizona and has still been talking and teaching about a lake spillover theory. And so even the National Geographic show that you're going to see here, they talk a little bit about that lake spillover. So if you want to cue that up, I'd love for people to see that.
It is a debate that has been going on for more than a century and which continues today.
I got interested in the Grand Canyon when I went to school and started studying, and I heard about the different ideas associated with the Grand Canyon and was just blown away when I found out we did not understand how the Grand Canyon formed. Something as iconic as the Grand Canyon wasn't understood, just seemed crazy to me, and so basically decided to dedicate a large portion of my life to trying to figure it out.
One theory is that several ancient rivers merged and their combined cutting power started digging out the canyon. Another assumes that the river cut down into the plateau as the land uplifted around it. But John Douglas has his own theory, one that has gained respect among many leading geologists since he first published his ideas in 2000. What Douglas calls his spillover theory seems to work well on paper.
Spillover is incredibly easy. All it means is the Colorado River poured into a basin. When it poured into that basin, it had to form a lake. And this lake was huge. All that lake had to do was rise and then spill across the plateau. It poured down, cutting rapidly, and over time you would have ended up with the beginnings of Grand Canyon very quickly.
At his college campus in Phoenix, Douglas is building a scale model experiment to see if his spillover theory actually works in real life. He sculpts tons of dirt into a model of the Colorado Plateau. Running faucets represent the flow of the Colorado River into the ancient lake.
Now we have our large lake. The water's getting higher, it's getting ready to spill across. We have a tiny little trickle of water pouring down off the lake. That little tiny trickle of water doesn't seem like much, but over time, that little bit of water flowing down that steep slope is going to gain energy. It's going to start cutting, making waterfalls that work their way back. One waterfall has now reached the lake. You can see that we have just released a significant amount of water, much more water than was previously pouring down. Now we have huge canyon cutting. Landslides are sloughing off the side of the canyon walls, the water flushing it downstream. The lake, you can see that it's starting to shrink in size. That lake is getting lower. And right there, you can see that we have cut our own small-scale version of the Grand Canyon.
Douglas's experiment proves that the spillover theory works, in miniature. But he needs evidence to show that it could have happened on an infinitely bigger scale. Douglas sets out in search of a lake, large enough and old enough to be the source of his spillover flood. He has a prime suspect in mind. This is the site of the ancient Lake Bittahoche, 100 miles to the east of the Grand Canyon. And a clue here on the old lake bed reveals how deep this lake once was.
These green clays, which indicate deep lake water, this is the classic evidence for the giant lake necessary for the overflow explanation of Grand Canyon.
These green deposits are only created in one specific environment.
To have green lake clays, you need deeper water where there is little oxidation. I think that's indication that the Colorado River has arrived in this basin, that it's made its way from the Rocky Mountains to this location. And this is basically stopover point before it eventually spills across to form the Grand Canyon.
Establishing the depth at this point lets Douglas work out how large an area was once covered by water. He compares the depth of the water with the contour height lines of the surrounding countryside. And that shows that Lake Bittahoche once spread over 20,000 square miles and contained more than 3,000 cubic miles of water. That makes it bigger than Lake Michigan.
Wow, what a great video. That really made it come alive for me to picture how big this lake is and what they're actually finding in the ground. So I'm glad we were able to check that out.
Absolutely, Caleb. And in that video, as you see, John Douglas is only referring to Lake Bittahoche, the Hopi Lake, that bottom section of the lake. That lake alone, as you saw in the video, the estimate was up to 3,000 cubic miles in total volume. That doesn't account for the rest of the lake system all the way to the north. So you begin to add that in, and absolutely, we believe perhaps 5, maybe even 6,000 cubic miles worth of water. Still ongoing research that we're putting together some of the models for that idea. So absolutely, we have a lot more water. You look at the Grand Canyon itself is roughly about 950 cubic miles in total volume. But yet, if we're talking about 5,000 to 6,000 cubic miles of water that would be rushing through there, that's a tremendous erosional potential. But not only that, it's not just water we're talking about, but all kinds of sand and rocks and debris, almost like this liquid sandpaper. I mean, we have a huge amount of water. That water, as it's spilling off the plateau, is spilling through the landscape, and water at that depth has a lot more water pressure, so it's adding to the erosive power. But also that water is going off the plateaus, carving through the Grand Canyon. Rapid water is spilling through. We have processes like cavitation that creates vacuum bubbles, especially behind the surface of objects. These vacuum bubbles, once they collapse, act like, tiny, almost like little microscopic, jackhammers, you might say, or like dynamite. They have explosive power to actually pulverize rocks and landscape very, very quickly. We've seen the erosion power of that happening in many cases around the world. And you look at this, we're talking about all this water draining through here. Now, geologists know that the lakes used to exist. The lake bed environment, the shoreline environments that you see, they all attest to the lake being there. But one of the questions that has to be answered is, where did all that water go?
Yeah.
If all that water was held in the middle of a plateau, there has to be a way for it to have left the plateau.
Sure.
Now we look at it today, and there are numerous rivers and streams that flow into the middle of the Colorado Plateau, but there's really only one exit route of any good size by which water can leave the Colorado Plateau that we have today. Guess what that one exit route, or that one crack in the side of the bowl, happens to be? Talking about the Grand Canyon, right? It's the exit route, the drainage of all of that. Now, looking at it, we know the lakes were there. The only possible exit route is the Grand Canyon. Now, you realize you can't have the Grand Canyon ever existing, though, at the same time as these lakes, because you can't fill a bowl of water 2,000 feet deep if you already have a giant crack in the side of that bowl. That tells us scientifically, geologically, the lakes had to be there first, and then the canyon had to come afterwards. Again, as you look in the video where John Douglas is at, that Betahoche Formation is between 6,300 feet and 6,600 feet. Yet the bottom of that lake basin, for example, you go to Cameron, Arizona, you're looking at right around 42 to 4,300 feet in elevation. So if that's the lowest point of that lake basin bowl, and the highest point is about 6,600 feet, boy, we've got about 2,000 feet deep, perhaps, for portions of Lake Betahoche to be. That's a lot of water, my friend. Now, all that water we see on there, we also see evidence that it left rapidly and quickly. That water did not simply dry up or evaporate into the landscape. We know what dried up lakes look like, right? They leave behind massive salt beds and deposits, like the Bonneville Salt Flats, over there in western Utah and into Nevada. That is the evidence, we believe, of a left behind dried up lake basin. That the evaporates that were left behind, the salt evaporates that were left as a result of a dried up lake basin. Now we look at how much water we're talking about from this huge lake. We drive out there along the desert landscape, and guess what? No salt deposits of this size and scale exist out there. It's as if the lake water was there, and then instantly it wasn't. Now, if you look at it, the only possible way, the only possible evacuation that we could have off the Colorado Plateau for all this water to have been there and then not there is via the Grand Canyon. But again, the Grand Canyon could not have existed while the lakes were there. You can't put the cart before the horse, my friend. You put two and two together and you realize the draining of this massive lake system, we believe, is the exact process that carved its own escape route as it drained off there. Now, that's not too unbelievable. We've actually seen very similar things happen even in our own lifetimes. For example, here is a picture of a breached dam lake spill, that happened. This is about June 5th of 1976, and this is the Teton Reservoir and the Teton Dam up in Idaho. June 5th, in the morning, people noticed there was a little trickle of water that was starting to spill through this earthen dam that was being filled up. And a little trickle of water, not that big a deal, right, Caleb? Yeah, just a little trickle. Go pack some dirt into it. They tried. They actually sent a couple bulldozer operators to try to pack in some dirt and push some dirt in there to hold this lake back, and that was a bad idea. Because as this thing began to start off as a little trickle, what started as a little tiny trickle, little tiny wet spot began to grow bigger and bigger, and these guys were backing up these bulldozers as fast as they could to get out of the way because the whole thing began to blow out into collapse right around 9:30, if I remember right. By about 11:30, you see the top picture here, this whole lake began to spill through its containment wall, okay? It spilled through, and then the aftermath is the picture you see at the bottom. This is actually in a little while after that, but this is basically the same shot from the same location, and the little red circle you see there shows you people standing closer to the foreground, shows you for scale, teeny tiny people, but look behind them. You see behind them to the left a carved out V-shaped section, and to the right, another carved out section. This whole section was carved out. This entire wall was carved out not just of the compacted earth to make the dam, but also, as you see to the left, it carved right down through solid rock. It carved a canyon system, you might say, a breach, as you can see here, hundreds of feet deep, hundreds of feet wide, and it carved out that entire thing you see there in only 5 hours of time.
Wow.
We're talking about a massive amount of water, a lot of water in a little bit of time did this, not a long time in a little bit of water.
Right.
Likewise, we've seen other things like Mount St. Helens, right? So May 18th of 1980, Mount St. Helens famously erupted. During that eruption and smaller subsequent eruptions, it laid down landscape, of soft sediments and ash debris and all kinds of stuff, creating even layers that we can see fine, almost, very thin layers that were created from a volcanic blast, that was traveling hundreds of miles from the volcano. But a neat thing that happened not long after that, just a couple hundred years after the major, couple years after the major eruption happened, we had a smaller eruption that happened on Mount St. Helens that melted a bunch of snow and ice pack that were up there on top. And that snow and ice pack and water and mud came rushing down the front face of Mount St. Helens, carving out what you see here, Engineers Canyon. In the front face of Mount St. Helens, multiple canyons have been carved very quickly. Engineers Canyon, Lewitt Canyon, Step Canyon, they've all been carved since 1980, very quickly. Now, it's hard to see for scale here, but Engineers Canyon, as you see in this picture, is about 100 to 120 feet deep. Okay, and it has multiple side canyons. It has U-shaped amphitheaters. It has a lot of physical features that match the Grand Canyon. In fact, sometimes it's referred to as the Little Grand Canyon of Mount St. Helens because it's 40 times smaller, but it has the physical features that resemble the Grand Canyon. Now, interestingly, Caleb, if you were to go up there, and I've been up there to Mount St. Helens a couple times to study it, if you go up to Mount St. Helens and look at it, at the bottom of there, it's hard to see in the picture, but there is actually a stream flowing through the bottom of Engineers Canyon. Now, if you didn't know anything about the history of what took place there, you could go to Engineers Canyon and you could stand at the bottom of that canyon. You could look 100 feet above your head. You could look at the stream at your feet and the canyon wall above you. And naturally, you probably would assume that stream carved out the canyon, right?
Yeah,
that's what we're taught.
Know any better?
If you didn't know any better, we're taught, rivers and streams carve canyons. So standing in this canyon must have been carved out by this stream, and it must have taken hundreds of thousands, maybe a couple million years for this little small stream at my feet to carve out this entire canyon. That's what we're taught with uniformitarian geology. But if you believed that, you'd be dead wrong. We know when this canyon was formed. This canyon was formed within a single day, catastrophically, from a catastrophe that happened, a lot of water in a little bit of time. Likewise, standing at the Grand Canyon, you might say, looking at that river down below, looking at this canyon, you might say, well, this canyon must have been carved by this river. Over millions of years, a slow, gradual erosion has taken place here, a long time in a little bit of water, right? And I would say the exact opposite is true. Not just because I believe in a global flood, and I don't believe that the Bible gives us millions and millions of years for its formation, but because I believe in the geology I see in the landscape environment. A lot of water did this, I believe, in a little bit of time, not a long time in a little bit of water. And likewise, I would also say there is a canyon there, not because there's a river down below, but there's a river down below because there is a Grand Canyon. The Colorado River that was filling up these lake basins and all these other rivers, they now have an exit route off the Colorado Plateau via the Grand Canyon. And so I believe that there's a canyon, not because there's a river, but there's a river now because there was a canyon. The canyon was opened up first as a spill through of all this lake water, and now to this day remains as an exit route for all of this water on the Colorado Plateau that can collectively joins together and flows off and out of there. A lot of water in a little bit of time.
Yeah. Now, how much time do you think it was that carved the Grand Canyon?
That's a great question. I love it. So we kind of place the timing roughly about 700 to 1,000 years after the flood, I believe. I believe this took place at the end of the Ice Age period, and I believe we have direct physical geological evidence that shows us that. But this amount of water spilling through here could carve this canyon in a matter of days to weeks, we believe. That amount of catastrophe, amount of water pouring through here, ripping out the side canyons, spiraling eddies of water that are ripping out U-shaped amphitheaters, super saturated landscape. I believe that this happened not long after the flood, and the processes could carve this canyon in a matter of days to weeks. Now, it would be fair to say to you that Dr. John Douglas, who I showed the video before, he, as far as I know, is not a creationist or nor a Christian. he would not agree necessarily with us as far as the recentness of how this canyon was formed, right after Noah's flood. He still, I believe, would still say, yes, the Colorado River started flowing through the Grand Canyon as it was ripped out catastrophically by these lakes. He would probably still give that a time period of about 5 to 6, maybe up to 8 million years ago for that event to take place. So I'll be fair to him and say he's not going to agree with me on every single point here. But when you look at the mechanisms, the speed by which this canyon could be carved, you begin to see a lot of similarities between even a secular model and what we are seeing and teaching nearly every day at the Grand Canyon. So I want to be fair to him and say he's not on the same page 100% as what we are, and that's okay. We see evidence, we look at the evidence back and forth, and I believe it points to the same conclusion: a lot of water in a little bit of time.
Yeah, I think that's good to acknowledge and to point out that, but they do have a similar mechanism carving the canyon. Well, pretty much the same thing, the breach dam, but you're talking about Bitahoche and the Grand Canyon Lakes, or the Grand Lakes up there as well, probably.
Yeah.
Now, I had a comment a little while ago from Jim related to the lakes, and he was talking about fossil evidence of extensive marine organisms. But fossils would not likely form since the sea creatures would not be rapidly covered over sediments necessary for fossils to form.
So the sea creature fossils we find, it's a great question. I love it, Jim. The sea creature fossils we find are found in the layers below the Bitahoche Formation. Okay. We find them in the sediments basically from the Tapete Sandstone all the way up until the Chinle Formation that sits directly below the Bitahoche Formation. Those are all layers we believe that were deposited during the flood as the oceans, were propelled across the continents. Those ocean environments, were brought onto the land. That's when we find marine creatures buried on the land in the landscape. But beyond that, we find other terrestrial fossils, okay, not necessarily formed by the flood, because even after the flood in Noah's day, we would still have subsequent smaller local or regional catastrophes that absolutely could and would bury organisms, plants and animals alike. Around this area, we had a tremendous amount of volcanic activity. Few people realize this, but northern Arizona is home to the largest volcanic field basically in the contiguous United States. From the mountain just behind my house here, you can climb to the top of Humphreys Peak, you can look up there, and you can see nearly 1,000 volcanoes along the open landscape. 600 to 1,000 volcanoes that you can see from there, depending on how clear the day is. This whole landscape environment is covered by volcanic activity. And so that would produce massive amounts of earthquakes, of ash deposits. We have a huge landscape. We have things like the Petrified National Forest nearby here, all these petrified, fossilized trees. We have even some post-flood catastrophes, but you're right. It's a catastrophe. It's rapid burial that needs to take place oftentimes for fossils to be preserved. And we do find some fossils from the flood onwards, but not marine fossils, but land fossils from some of these local or regional catastrophes. That's a great question. I love that you brought that up.
Now, I think you mentioned to me in the past, Nate, that there's some evidence of tundra snow geese fossils. Is that right? I
love it. Yeah, let's segue into that part. So one of the things, people have oftentimes said, well, this lake system you're talking about, they've doubted the existence of the lake system being this size or even a lake being there. I know even some creation geologists, I know one in particular that kind of doubts the existence of these lakes, but absolutely, when you come up here, come visit me, I'll go take you out there. I'll show you the exact evidence we're talking about. Not only do you see the shoreline environment, but we do find direct physical evidence of a big lake that was out there and this lake being in existence during the Ice Age. One of those things we find, and it's actually about 2 miles from my house, just up the road at the Museum of Northern Arizona, it's actually housed there, are fossils that were from this lake system, from the Bitahoche Formation, at kind of at the southern end of it. So if you look on this picture, you've got Hopi Lake, and near the bottom section of it, there's a section down there where we used to have a big shoreline environment. And in that shoreline environment, we actually find fossil bones and fossil trackways, walking tracks from things like Canada geese, or the Canada geese that were up there, as well as, show you a picture here. There you go. We have tundra swans.
Oh, wow. Now,
this slab you can see here, they have fossils that are right there in the Museum of Northern Arizona. And these are basically what we call tundra swans. Now, as the name suggests, where do tundra swans live? in the tundra. Okay, so not typically in the southern regions down here. The red arrow you see there, that shows you basically right around the same location where they were found. Now, that's kind of outside the typical range of the tundra swans. But the tundra swan fossils, okay, they've been identified not as other swans or not as other geese, but actually as tundra swans. And trackways from other types of geese and swans have been found right here at the bottom of this lakeshore environment. Now, swans and geese, as we know, live in lakes and in water systems, right? If you drive out there to the Bitahoche Formation area today, out to the eastern side of Arizona, it's all dry desert. It's a painted desert, my friend. Now, what does a desert imply? Usually we're thinking not a lot of lakes and water.
Yeah.
But in the past, direct physical evidence that the lakes used to be there. First of all, you can't preserve trackways from these geese and swans in just dry desert sand. They would be living around and in this lake system and around the shorelines, and their fossil bones are found out there. So it tells us a few different things, Caleb. It tells us not only was there a lake system, a big lake system existing, but it also shows us where the shoreline was at. So where I showed you on the map about the lake and the shore, right at the bottom edge of it, right at the very bottom edge is exactly the location where these fossils have been found. So the physical evidence that we're looking at from satellite imagery and shoreline environment matches up the exact location of where we find the fossils of these birds that were living there. Not only tells us and shows us there was a lake, not only shows us where the shoreline was at, which matches up perfectly, but it also shows us, I believe, that this lake system existed during this ice age period, when colder climates and temperatures would have brought down much more cold and ice down in this area. Now, I'm not necessarily believing that the ice age covered northern Arizona with glaciers. I don't believe that we find too much evidence for glaciation down this far south, but certainly up into Utah and Colorado, just above us, we had glaciers, absolutely. But it did bring down the cold so that, which is tundra in Canada up there, is now brought down. So that zone where they typically live is now my home right here in Arizona. Yeah. So they're living around this lake. They're living, I believe, takes place during this time period. And it shows us direct evidence that it was colder climates here at that time. And so we have a lake that existed. We have the shoreline of the lake that existed. We have the lake that existed during this ice age period. And again, remember, the lake never could have existed if the canyon was already opened up at this point.
Yeah.
So again, it also helps address, I believe, some of the other theories, even among creationists, who might say that the Grand Canyon was formed as the process of the drainage of the flood waters themselves, draining away off the continents, that maybe as the floodwaters drained off, they carved the canyon at the same time. That is a possible theory, but I don't personally see much evidence in that at all. And I'm basing that upon the physical evidence that I see every day in the environment and landscape, having lived here and studied here basically most of my entire life. Evidence of the lakes shows that these lakes had to have existed at this time. Now, interestingly, not only do we find the tundra swans and other geese and things like that, but actually in the Museum of Northern Arizona, we have fossilized ice casts, okay? So ice crystals that have formed around the edge of the lake that have now been fossilized because it filled in with other sediment and has actually preserved fossilized ice crystals. And this whole thing, I mean, this lake system, some of these fossils were actually been found from the 1920s to the 1940s. Edwin McKee did a lot of work in the 30s and 40s on that area, all the way up to a research paper I was just reading this morning in 1975, where they're talking about a lot of this stuff. And so we have direct evidence that it was a much colder climate and this lake system existed during that time period.
Yeah, no, thanks for breaking that down. Now, I think we have some friendly pushback on that. Someone was quoting another great creation geologist. Here, I could bring it up here. That may take a different angle on this. They said, Kevin, thanks for commenting. They said, I guess they're quoting Dr. Clary, fictional lakes that some geologists propose emptied in a catastrophic manner to carve Grand Canyon, but are based on little, if any, geological evidence.
All right. So you're right. Dr. Tim Clary is one of the few creation geologists that stands out that doesn't agree with a lake spillover theory. Absolutely. And I've gone through every one of his research papers that have been put out there, and I think there's absolute great questions to those. One of those is what I was just talking about with this lake system being in place. I believe we have direct physical evidence of this lake, and that this lake existed for some time into the Ice Age, and this lake, again, never could have existed if the Grand Canyon were already opened up.
Sure.
So in Tim Clary's models, if the Grand Canyon was opened up by the recession of the floodwaters, we never could have had a trapped, dam, you might say, to fill up this lake basin like what we see here. Part of that also, I believe, is what we find in this lake basin. So I tend to refer to it as the Hopi Basin. In that environment, that landscape, nearby, just to the northwest or northeast of us, we have Wupatkin National Monument. We have the Little Colorado River that flows up through there, and we have the surrounding area and landscape with the Navajo Reservation, other private ranch properties, and things like that. It's all within this Hopi Formation. So part of the research that I have yet to publish, because I've been working on this for the last 2, maybe 3 years now, I want to show you a few pictures here that have never been seen by anybody else in the world except for myself. I have not showed them to anybody, maybe a couple of us with our team here at Canyon Ministries. But beyond that, I want to show you some really interesting evidence that you can find out there that shows us what I believe is lake spillover. One of those things, if you go out to the Hopi Basin, there are some fantastic hills of sediment that are sitting out there. And this sediment is not what we refer to as localized geology. This sediment, these rocks, this formation of these basically mounds that have been left behind do not come from the surrounding sandstone, limestone, and shale that we see in northern Arizona. They exhibit rocks that have been brought in from, in some cases, hundreds of miles away. Edwin McKee, back in the 1930s and 40s, proposed and basically showed that some of the rocks in this formation in this area mapped them out all the way out to the Uncompahgre region up by Colorado. And I was up there back in May studying the Uncompahgre region up by Colorado, up by Buena Vista, Salida area, matching some of the same rocks and geology that you see there to the exact rocks that have been deposited way over here. So that shows us that some of these rivers were flowing into this Hopi Basin, bringing material as far away as Colorado into this Hopi Basin. Just a month or two ago, Dr. John Douglas, along with some others, also pushed another paper out there that talks about this Lake Hopi Formation, and he also identifies the sedimentation filling in of this lake system. And so this is what we're looking at. Let me show you. In this area, we have these big mounds that are actually on top of here, these big uplifted hills, and on top of here is an example of a big, massive boulder that sits near the top of it. Now, this is about 100 to 120 feet above the present-day Little Colorado River, where it is. And so looking at this area, we can see that there's a big boulder up here. But if you look at this boulder and examine it, there's a few interesting things about this boulder, Caleb, that are fascinating. This boulder is sitting on top of a hill 100 feet above the surrounding desert landscape. On top of this boulder and glued to the side of this boulder are lots of rocks and stones and pebbles. You see that?
Yeah.
So they're not only glued onto the side there, but they're also sitting on top of it. Now, going out there, there's a number of locations just like this where I've surveyed this. This gluing of the boulders, basically, here's a little crack that you can see what this is.
Oh, wow.
Lots of different rocks that have been brought in, okay, and they're glued to the side of this boulder. Now, interestingly, they're only glued to one side of this boulder. In fact, if you look at it, they're not on the other sides. They're not on the other. They're only on the top, resting on top, or glued to one side. Now, when I was out there a couple of years ago, I started looking at this, thinking about it, and I realized for them to be glued to the side, when you look at it, the gluing mechanism that we see here is actually dissolved limestone that's kind of glued this stuff together onto the boulder. It's what we refer to as travertine. In fact, speaking of travertine, on the other side of this boulder, on part of it, we actually see direct travertine deposits. Now, travertine deposit is oftentimes found where there's flash flood environments. We see it at the Grand Canyon, where the Little Colorado River flows into the main Colorado River stem. We go up the Little Colorado River Gorge. It's a fascinating place to take river guests to. And we find travertine deposits all around there from flash floods and things like that. On a 4-day river trip with us, we'll take you up to Travertine Grotto oftentimes. And travertine deposits are found in there on the surface of walls. They're basically redeposited calcium carbonate, redeposited limestone that is typically formed as a result of a spring or some kind of flash flood environment. And that's what we see here. There's a lot of travertine. So in other words, there was some kind of flash flood or some kind of big flood moving water event that dissolved limestone and glued these rocks and pebbles to the side of this big boulder. And when you look at it, they're only found, like I said, on one side of it. And that is the case after boulder after boulder after boulder. You begin to match these up and you realize you have a boulder here and another boulder there and hundreds of feet away is another one, but these rocks are only ever found glued onto one side. That indicates to us that there was water movement pushing onto one side of this boulder. In other words, directional flow that was carrying and transporting all kinds of rocks and pebbles and things like that, mixing and churning up with the mud, basically the cement, you might say, the gluing together cement of the travertine and cementing them onto the side of a boulder as it's pushing that sediment in one direction.
Oh.
Now, you go. I haven't even talked to you about this one yet, much have I? So this is new for you
it's
too.
kind of new to me. Yeah.
So going and looking at this, you can actually trace out and map out. Okay, so what is the backside of the boulder? Which direction am I facing? So I've gone out there and measured it. We have compass. We have directional findings and measurements. This cementing direction faces exactly towards where the Little Colorado River flows and dumps into the main Grand Canyon, where the Little Colorado River Gorge incisors deeply into the Grand Canyon. In other words, these are natural rock pointers that point us in the direction of flow of water, and that direction flow of water goes directly into where this lake basin would spill into the Grand Canyon. So I believe what we're looking at here, Caleb, is directional movement of this lake water.
Yeah.
It's not only carrying water with it into the Grand Canyon as it's spilling through, it's also carrying sediment deposits. Now, again, this is on top of a hill. This is on top of a mound. The only way you can get this glued onto the side of it is if the lake was higher than this and all the sediment was being brought catastrophically rushing through there.
Wow, that's awesome.
Speaking of catastrophic, looking at this boulder, we have directional scouring marks on the sides of it. See these lines?
Yeah.
These lines indicate to us the directional scouring as rocks are grinding up against it, as there's a massive amount of slurry going up against the sides of it. Here's again some carving, basically contact where imagine other rocks and boulders nearby it. Other rocks are being scouring alongside of it, and they're gouging out these marks. You can actually see some of the directional kind of angled cross bedding of the original part of the rock. This is part of Moenkopi sandstone. You can see the Moenkopi, cross bedding angle, but then almost straight across there, you can see as rocks are now going against it, they're gouging out sides of it. And you can see this along the boulders that are around there. Now, so not only do we see all the cementing only on one side, in fact, it's the case every time, and on top of it, we see some rocks that have been left behind, basically a set down deposit. Not only do we see that, but the rocks themselves that are found on top of it, the rocks themselves on top of it indicate another evidence of directional movement and flow. This is actually looking down on top of one of these boulders and rocks. And it's hard to see in this picture a little bit, but there are a number of rocks that are flat, round, flat rocks, but are not lying flat. They're lying up on end, straight up and down. Okay, kind of like if I got my phone here. They're not lying like this. They're lying up and down, and they're oriented. In fact, you can see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I mean, multiples of these rocks are actually oriented in the same direction, just like this. Now, to get rocks oriented, it's not necessarily imbricated rocks where they're stacked up, on one another, lying in a direction. They're all oriented one way. Like if you were to have a coin and you were to roll a coin across the ground, it rolls in the direction that you push it. Sure. In the very same way, if you're looking at what we have here, you have rocks that are up on end. In other words, a force or a current of water is picking up these rocks. It's moving them up on end. They're starting to roll and they're tumbling because of fast moving water action. And that direction of roll, like a weather vane, they are pointing these rounded, smooth, coin-shaped rocks. They're pointing them in the direction of current flow. And guess what? I've measured them. The exact angle, and I've drawn it out along the huge map, the exact angle that every one of these rocks up on end here tend to trend towards is where the Little Colorado River Canyon flows into the main Grand Canyon. It is a directional pointer, like I said, like a weather vane, that points these rocks that are now rolling because of fast-moving water action. It points them in the direction of flow exactly as this lake basin spill through has been proposed as well.
And you found several locations where the rocks are pointing that direction?
Absolutely. This is not the only one. There are multiple locations. Yeah. Now, if you go to this area, there's multiple big mounds that have been left behind as sediment deposits. And again, a lot of these rocks do not even come from here. You can examine the rocks in geology. This is not localized geology. Most of the rocks you see in this picture that are cemented on top of this boulder, most of these rocks actually come from hundreds of miles away. They're not found even in the White Mountains of Arizona where the Little Colorado River originates. They're found being brought in from hundreds of miles away from flow of water that came into this basin. But here's the real cool thing. Not only have we found these rocks sitting here outside of the Grand Canyon, sitting out here in the Bitahoche Basin, but this exact same sediment has been found, I believe, in the Grand Canyon itself. And this is from one of my last river trips just this last year. The same sort of landscape sediment that you see where the basin is at, is also found in the Grand Canyon, and in only a very unique location. Now, on our river trips, most of the time you can see, lots of pebbles and rocks and things like that. And the vast majority of the time, you're easily able to identify where this particular rock, even in a stream bed, or a side canyon, came from. You can pick up a rock down there and say, oh, this is red wall limestone that came from, hundreds of feet up there. It's tumbled down, it's weathered, it's eroded, it's been carried in by water. Or this is a piece, here's a nice piece of chert. Well, this probably came from perhaps a Supai group. You can look at this, and you can look at the sandstone, limestone, and shale of the Grand Canyon. You can look even at your feet, even when they're all jumbled up. You can see and you can realize where these rocks came from typically. But there's a really fascinating location that's found kind of in the, right near the beginning of the Grand Canyon proper, where it really opens up, a little section called Furnace Flats. As you can see here, this is a picture I took this last September on a 7-day river trip that I was leading down through there. Now, on top of Furnace Flats in these areas, we have these big kind of rounded hills that are basically made up of the Grand Canyon supergroup. And you can hike up to there. And interestingly, down at the river edge, you don't see it. Anywhere else in the canyon, in all the years I've been doing river trips, I've never seen the same sediment. But found up near the top of these ridges and these big rounded hills, or we find the same sort of rocks and geology that you would see in the Hopi Lake Basin Formation throughout parts of Upatki and the Navajo Reservation. You can see the same sort of geology. Now, again, these rocks and pebbles that you see here, the vast majority of these are not local geology. This is not localized geology. These kind of rocks that you see here that are sitting on top, in fact, you don't even encounter metamorphic or igneous rocks, like you would see a rock in this pile here. You don't even encounter that kind of geology for quite a while until you start getting into the Grand Canyon, the depths of the Grand Canyon. So for these kind of rocks to have been brought in and deposited from here means they could not have come from the Grand Canyon itself yet. You're not even into the geology of these type of rocks. These type of rocks have been brought in from the Rocky Mountains. And they were brought in, I believe, into this big lake basin. And then they were brought in as the lake spilled over into the Grand Canyon. As it started to carve out the Grand Canyon, not only is it bringing in water, but it's bringing in over the edge of that rim and it's bringing down in the canyon all of those rocks and pebbles and debris. All of that stuff that's sitting in the Hopi Basin is now also being washed into the Grand Canyon. And as the waters are going and carving and draining down through the Grand Canyon, some of that sediment is sitting on top and resting atop some of these hills left behind. They are erosional remnants. And I believe that's exactly what we're seeing here at the Grand Canyon. As this water is spilling through here, it's causing erosion. And as it continues to carve down into the canyon, some of that is left kind of a set down material that's been set down on top. And like I said, in all the years I've been doing river trips, I've only seen this type of gravel, this type of set down material at the top of these really interesting hills. And so I am fascinated to get back to there and do some actual goods, taking some pictures and studying some of what we see out here. But this Hopi Basin material, I believe, that we find in that location matches up what we find in the Uncompahgre region, like Edwin McKee talked about, brought into this lake basin, dumped into here, and left behind in here as a remnant result of the actual event of the canyon. Again, when you see the directional flow of movement and material, it all literally points in the same direction.
Yeah.
That's a long answer. Whew.
No, yeah, that's fascinating. And I appreciate just sharing some of the on the ground research and evidence that you're finding. Yeah. And there's so many great creation scientists, and I have, of course, the utmost respect for Dr. Clary and reading his book, Carved in Stone. Have it showcasing it right here because it's a phenomenal book, and his work on the mega sequences is just top notch. So
yes, but Dr. Tim Clary is second to none in that area. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I've taken him on a 4-day river trip through there. He and I have spent time in the canyon together. Love his work. He and I probably see a little bit differently on the Grand Canyon Formation, but that's what we do in science and geology. We study, we have theories, we test models, we go out there. And so, yeah, that's part of it. But even what I'm showing you right now, this is not a finished topic. I mean, I have yet to write the paper on this because I'm still in the middle of a research project on this study, and it hasn't been published yet because it's not a complete theory yet. Even once it gets published, we're going to have pushback and feedback, and that's what we enjoy. I love it.
Yeah, and more friendly pushback is what we need, and I think that's great in the pursuit of engaging with the truth. So now I had some questions related to the type of erosion that we see in the canyons. it looks like it was, I think I've read some that say it was swept clean instead of over millions of years, because wouldn't we expect more erosion or talus in the canyon if it was for this long process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. I mean, if the canyon was slowly carved out by the Colorado River, so what they teach up at the canyon is that the river that we see today never really got much bigger than what we have. Now, we did have, of course, periodic flash flood events. Yes, absolutely. And we still have some bigger high flows. Yeah. And definitely before the Glen Canyon Dam was put in place in 1963, we did have bigger flash floods, but not to the size that would cover the width of the Grand Canyon. 10 to 18 miles wide this canyon is, over a mile deep, 277 miles long. But the river itself would not get to miles wide, So, but what they teach typically is that the river carved basically slowly downwards, and that weathering and erosion happened from the sides of these cliffs. The debris fell down from the sides of the cliff, eventually made its way down to the Colorado River, and that river, like a giant conveyor belt, carried all of that material out of there. Now, if that were the case, you're exactly right. I would expect you would find much more debris at the base of some of these cliffs. We should see huge sloping debris piles, because before a rock can get from the cliff edge to the river, it's got to find its way somehow, in some cases, 7 miles away from the edge of the canyon to the river itself. It's got to find its way to there, slowly eventually get brought to that river to be carried on out of there. We should find massive amounts of debris and talus in there, but we don't find a whole lot of that. There is some, absolutely. There are slopes. No doubt about that.
Now, talus
don't find a nice gradual sloping. It's really a cut and cleaned canyon, you might say, Caleb.
Okay. Now, for those who aren't familiar with that term, talus, what is that?
So talus is basically the broken piles of rocks and debris that we often find at the edges of cliffs and formations. Scree slopes, you might also call it scree. But it's basically, weathered and erosional remnants that have basically fallen out and kind of opened up as a slope, kind of typically below a cliff or a formation.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, thanks for breaking that down. So now you mentioned earlier the Grand Staircase sediment. Where's all the sediment? Where did it go when the Grand Canyon was carved out?
Well, that's a fantastic question. So I don't know if I have a picture that will help illustrate it as much, but if we look at the Grand Canyon formation, here's the Bright Angel Fault line going through here I was talking about earlier. But if you look at the Grand Canyon formation, we have a tremendous amount of material, roughly 950 cubic miles worth of sediment that have been removed from the Grand Canyon. Now, naturally thinking, if the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon, whether it was, a million years, 70 million years, whatever time scale you want to throw at it, if that river was a mechanism responsible for carving and removing that material, then all of that material should be carried further downstream, and we should find roughly 950 cubic miles worth of sediment piled up at the end of the river, especially where it dumps into the Sea of Cortez down there by Baja, California. We should find a delta roughly 950 cubic miles worth of sediment. That's a tremendous amount of material. Well, if you follow the Colorado River out of the Grand Canyon, it goes into Lake Mead that we have today, that was built back in 1935 with the Hoover Dam. From there, the Colorado River goes nearly straight south down to the Sea of Cortez down there by Baja, California, like I said. You follow the Colorado River down to its exit point, to the mouth of the river, and there is no major delta of the size expected from what we have with the Grand Canyon. Pretty good rivers make pretty good deltas, right? You look at the end of the Mississippi River, we have the Mississippi River Delta, we have the Amazon River Delta, the Nile River, we have the Nile River Delta, which is the biblical land of Goshen, where the Hebrew people were living. We see all of that rivers typically produce pretty good sized deltas. Yet look how much more material has been removed, supposedly, by the Colorado River than all these other rivers. We should see a massive, huge delta, but we don't. Where we believe we find the material at, is believed to have been found out over the Mojave Desert and into the Anza Borrego Desert. And I've even read some things where some geologists believe that the LA Basin sits on top of Grand Canyon sediments. Wow. Now we're talking about, in some cases, hundreds of miles away from where the Colorado River goes. The river goes here and then straight south, yet the material is found way over here to the west and to the southwest, where the river apparently never went to. Now, that question of where's all the sediment is almost exactly the topic of a talk that was given at the Grand Canyon National Park gathering that we had either this year or last year. I'm trying to remember when it was. But the question really was, where did all the sediment go to at the Grand Canyon? It is recognized as an enigma by the secular scientific geological community. Now, there are models that they're working on to propose it, absolutely. Just like we have models to propose a lake spillover and breach dam. The point is, they're still trying to puzzle over where all that sediment went to because it doesn't match up the Colorado River carving theory very easily. However, if you had a breach dam that ripped through here catastrophically and all of this water spilled through rapidly, what you would expect to find is that as it exited the Grand Canyon at the Grand Wash Cliffs, just before as you're going into Lake Mead, that this material is now being carried through here with all this water that's constricted to carving a canyon. Now the constriction is lifted because you end the Grand Canyon. The Grand Wash Cliffs are the terminus of the Grand Canyon, and it ends there. And now this, we might say, as a fireman's hose, cranked down with a sharp shooting nozzle. Now this hose is cranked wide open. This material is gouging and scouring at the Grand Canyon now can spread far and wide over a massive floodplain over the Mojave and Anza Borrego deserts, creating a huge wide floodplain that dumps the water and material far and wide, like I said, over a big floodplain. Now, Caleb, what creates floodplains?
Floodplains, I don't know.
Floods. It's in the name.
Yes,
So a
yes,
flood or a surge of water. In the western end of the Grand Canyon, we actually find surge deposits indicating there were big surges, big flooding events of what was coming out of the Grand Canyon. And so what I see, not only on the eastern side of the Grand Canyon as evidence of these lakes, is also evidenced by what we find to the western side of the Grand Canyon, where all the sediment went to in regards to a massive amount of water surging through here as a lake spillover or breach dam theory, perhaps. They could carve the canyon, like I said, rapidly and dump that material rapidly, not carrying out to the bottom of the Colorado River where we don't tend to find it at all.
Yeah. No, thanks for breaking that down. So the sediment, is it kind of being blasted out, or like how?
Yeah, that's the way I see it. It's blasted out there. I mean, if you drive out to the western side of the Grand Canyon, out of the Mojave Desert, Anza Borrego Desert, you're driving out on a landscape, pull your car over, take a look, and what you will find are tons and tons of unconsolidated gravel all over the place. This is sandstone, limestone, shale, mudstone, siltstone, all this stuff that's been churned up and ejected out there, and it's all jumbled up. It's not nicely stratified in many places. Not like you're finding rock layers like we find around here. You're finding all the rock layers that were broken up, jumbled up, shattered, and ejected out over the landscape. And in some cases, there's hundreds of feet thick of unconsolidated gravel fill, you might say.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Now, we'll kind of wrap up here, but one of the things I wanted to mention is the lava flows on the west side of the Grand Canyon. Why is that significant? I know that's been a big issue in articles and research recently.
Yeah, so we had a number of volcanic eruptions that happened right along the rim of the Grand Canyon, mostly on the north side of the canyon.
Okay, north side.
Right around 250 miles into there, kind of roughly around there. In fact, at River Mile 150, I should go back there. Right around River Mile 187, where we fly out of the Grand Canyon on our helicopters up to the North Rim to the Barton Ranch before ending a 7 or 9 day river trip. There's actually a lot of volcanoes around there. Vulcan's Throne is one of those great ones we can see from that river camp. And in that area, just before that and after that, we have direct evidence that that lava from volcanoes has actually erupted and spilled over the Grand Canyon all the way down to the rim, in fact. Down to the river. I'm trying to pull up a picture here while I'm talking. I should probably do one thing at a time. All the way down to the river. Let me pull up a picture. I think I've got it here somewhere. It might help illustrate that better. One second here. So volcanic eruptions. There we go. You see that? Yep. So that black line, you can see there kind of the Uinkaret lava flows. That kind of is a representation of some of the basalt lava that flowed down over the Grand Canyon all the way down to the river. And in some cases, it actually dammed up the Colorado River, we believe. And a number of times, that lava actually filled all the way down to there. And in some places, there's evidence that lava not only filled down to the river, but across the river, rising up against the south rim side, perhaps damming up that Colorado River maybe 1,000 feet. And 1,000-foot high lava dam within a mile-deep high Grand Canyon, but a lava dam that existed temporarily, and that lava dam existing there caused the water from the Colorado River to back up all the way, we believe, all the way up to the Little Colorado River Gorge, roughly 100 miles, 110 miles upstream from there. The water would back up all the way up to that point, and it could actually create an inner canyon lake. After the canyon was carved out initially, we have another lake system that was sitting inside the canyon, maybe 1,000 feet deep, maybe even perhaps rising up to where we see the Tonto platform with the Bright Angel Shale. Maybe it helped scour out some of that. But then the water broke through that little lava dam, and again, another inner canyon catastrophe, you might say, of this inner canyon lake spilled through, subsequently carving deeper into the canyon. So the story is not complete yet. I mean, there's not a lot of research that I've found that's been done on these lakes and how that would have affected the Grand Canyon as we know it, especially from, River Mile 187, you might say, onwards. We cover that section on our 4-day river trip. It's a 90-mile river trip that we do, which is fascinating. I'd love to get you out there, Caleb, on one of those trips. I've got your name on top of my list, my friend, because getting out there, we go down to the Grand Canyon. We actually fly from Las Vegas out to the Barten Ranch, which is a ranch on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. Your first day out there, you have horseback riding, skeet shooting, ATV rides out to the rim, big, great country Western dinner that's made with Barten beef, grass-fed cattle that raised from birth to slaughter. Basically, birth to burger right there. Actually, brisket or, we have there. And then that night, we have the best Wild West show for 80 miles.
Yes.
It is the only Wild West show for 80 miles, so therefore it's the best. But no, the folks at the Barten Ranch have been partnering with us for a number of years. They are fantastic, great family, great workers up there. And then the next morning, we helicoptered to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So you have about a 7-minute helicopter flight from the Barten Ranch to the very depths of the Grand Canyon right along the shore at River Mile 187. Then from there, we jump onto our boats, and we have, 2.5 days of floating down the Grand Canyon, seeing side canyons, going up waterfalls, Native American ruins, pictographs, petroglyphs, artifacts. I mean, fantastic stuff. Rapids. And then that last morning, we transfer about mid-morning to a high-speed jet boat. You have an hour-long jet boat floating and going through the ending portions of the Grand Canyon. You're zooming along. Really cool. I mean, waves are coming up behind you. See a spray from the river's coming up. We're zooming along. We see the glass skywalk bridge of the Wallapai Reservation. We see some great things down there. Then you go to the Grand Wash Cliffs. You enter into Lake Mead proper, and we stop right after that at a place where we get off at Pierce Ferry, jump onto a tour bus and back to Vegas. So, my friend, in 4 days, you got planes, helicopters, jetback, or jet boat, horseback ride, ATVs, helicopter, planes. I mean, talk about planes, trains, and automobiles. We throw it all together in a short time period. But that lower western end of the Grand Canyon, we see so much of that geology of volcanism, lava, volcanic rocks, lava spills. I mean, in fact, we're camping in camps surrounded by lava, lava formations that are down there. Pretty neat stuff. So,
wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, so that
sounds like a wonderful time.
Yeah, the lava spills, definitely had a hand to play. Now, there's not a lot of research done on that, to be honest. I would love to have somebody down there that could do more work on how that would have subsequently shaped the Grand Canyon. But those volcanoes, naturally, we can show directly formed after the Grand Canyon itself was already ripped open because they spilled over the edge of it. And some of these lava flows were actually witnessed, we believe, by Native Americans who were living there and around there at the time. Because the Incaret lava flows in particular, it has actually encased some of their villages, and we can find up there pottery fragments and things like that. Nearby here, just north of where I'm at, we have Sunset Crater Volcano, which we believe erupted right around 1,000 years ago. Right now, the latest, they're saying about right around 1075 AD. And that also erupted around there, and natives were living around there. We find pottery, we find basket imprints, corn cobs even, where either it covered over cornfields or they were throwing corn cobs, into the lava pits basically as kind of ritual sacrifice. And yes, it burned away the basket and the corn cob, but it left the imprint. So we have corn lava, you might say, in places around here. And that's in the museum as you go up there to the visitor center at Sunset Crater National Monument. So, we did have volcanoes erupting around here when Native Americans were witnessing it, both around the Sunset Crater and the Uinkaret lava flows that you see up there in the western end of Grand Canyon.
Oh, that's awesome. No, I think the secular models were dating the Grand Canyon really old, and then the lava flows, they realized, oh, it's younger, and then they adjusted their model, right?
Yeah, I mean, some of the models have been changed. I mean, the 70 million year old canyon has been reduced to a 5.5 to 6 million year old canyon, depending on how they kind of use some of their own dating methods. So, And it's a work in progress, Caleb. I mean, there's no, like I said, there's no scientific consensus on every feature and formation of the Grand Canyon, even how it was formed or when it was formed. There are still, I know personally, geologists and university professors that debate back and forth amongst themselves on even the age of the Grand Canyon. So, which is fun. That's why we love living here. It's still an ongoing mystery, and we pursue it in one way. And we start, like I said, absolutely and unashamedly with God's word being our foundation to that, and a global flood event. And so based upon that worldview, we stack up and build up the rest of what we see around us. And honestly, in my opinion, geologically, even, I think it makes a lot of sense. A lot of water and a little bit of time did this.
Yeah, amen. I totally agree. And man, this episode is been one of my favorites.
We're a little over 2 hours now, buddy.
Yeah, and what I'll say for those listening, if you guys like and subscribe and share, but we're also looking at doing, I have some ministry friends that they're going to hopefully break this two-part series in the Grand Canyon into smaller segments that you guys can share on each topic or so on. But I think also this episode accomplished many things in that we were able to see some new research. Hopefully you were inspired, somebody watching, to go into one of these fields of study. Honestly, like my goal is to get my master's in apologetics, and if there was time and money, I would probably study geology too. I love this topic. It's so exciting. And I hope someone watching is inspired to go into science for the glory of God, because we care about the truth and we want to honor God in all fields of knowledge. Need to come under the authority of God's word. And I think we can really do a lot of good in the church and in society when we're doing great research like Nate's doing, and Dr. Snelling, Dr. Clary, many great guys. And I just am so grateful to you and to Canyon Ministries for all the work that you guys are doing for the kingdom. I just really appreciate you coming on today, brother.
Yeah, absolutely. I love being here with you, Caleb. You and I mean, you guys watching this probably don't know, but Caleb and I are talking back and forth all the time. I mean, at all hours of day and night. I love it. And I will also extend that to anybody watching this video. This is, yes, we're a little over 2 hours, but this is barely scratching the surface. I mean, our shortest tour at the Grand Canyon is a 4-hour tour. And even then we can't cover everything. We have a 9-day river trip and we still can't cover everything about Grand Canyon. So I will say right now, this is not in and of itself a complete geological model or answering every question of the Grand Canyon. We simply don't have enough time for that. However, I am available to anybody watching this. If you have questions, email me, nate@canyonministries.org. I would love to have that conversation. If you are in Flagstaff and you have questions and you want to discuss this, personally, I'm not a big fan of debate just for debate's sake and argument. But if you want to have a discussion, I love discussion. I will buy you coffee. We will sit down and I will spend all afternoon with you going over some of these questions. If you have it seriously, that is the heart of our ministry. As we talked about at the beginning of this program, our heart is more than just showing rocks and facts of the canyon, more than just fun adventures and tours of the Grand Canyon and the Colorado Plateau. It is about a message of this canyon and helping answer those questions. So that is our heart. And you can take me up on that. I've done that. I've gone to people. I've bought them lunch and dinner and coffee. We've sat down and had those conversations. Absolutely. And you don't have to see eye to eye with me, and that's okay. We can still have that conversation and be able to have some discussion. I love learning. And so let's engage with that, just like this podcast is, about engaging the truth, right? So we want to continue to open that opportunity and those doors for that.
Amen. Well, God's blessings on you and your ministry and your family. And I hope you guys and all our viewers have a very Merry Christmas.
Yeah. Merry Christmas to you, Caleb, and everybody watching. Love you guys.
All right.